What's your terrible roommate story? My friend Matt called screaming that his finger had been cut off, and his roommate Lucas wouldn't let him leave until he paid 3 months of back rent. I grabbed a bag of ice and raced to their house, knowing we had maybe 60 minutes to get that finger reattached before the tissue died forever. I burst through their front door to find Matt in the kitchen with his right hand wrapped in blood-soaked towels and his severed index finger in a Ziploc bag on the counter. His face was gray, and he was swaying on his feet while he explained that Lucas had his car keys and had blocked the driveway with his van. Lucas was standing in the doorway to the garage with Matt's keys dangling from his fingers, and this weird smile on his face. He said calmly, $3,000 is what he owes me. I told him Matt would die without immediate medical attention, but Lucas just shrugged and said, Matt should have thought about that before spending rent money on tools instead of paying what he owed. I grabbed the finger and packed it properly in ice, then tried to push past Lucas to my car, but he stepped outside and I saw he'd parked his van horizontally across the driveway, completely blocking my car in. Matt stumbled out holding his mutilated hand with blood still dripping through the towels, begging Lucas to move the van. Lucas laughed and said Matt needed to pay first, reminding us we only had an hour, and suggested we better start calling people for money. I checked my phone and realized we'd already lost 10 minutes. I tried to call an ambulance, but Lucas warned that he'd tell them Matt had threatened him with a weapon, and the cops would spend an hour sorting it out. Matt was getting paler, and I could see him going into shock from blood loss. I promised we'd get Lucas his money after the hospital, but he shook his head and pulled out his phone to start recording us. He demanded Matt say on camera that he'd pay him today. Matt was crying now with his whole body shaking as he admitted he didn't have the money. Lucas walked over to his van and let the air out of one tire, then another, saying that even if he moved it now, we weren't going anywhere. We'd lost 15 minutes already when I called an Uber, but Lucas stood in the street and waved them off when they arrived, telling the driver we were trying to skip out on drug debt. The driver sped away and Lucas came back laughing, telling us to try another one because this was fun for him. Matt collapsed on the driveway and I checked the towel to find way too much blood with the flesh already looking pale and wrong after 20 minutes gone. I tried to carry Matt to the neighbor's house, but Lucas followed us, shouting that Matt was a thief who'd stolen from him, making such a scene that the neighbors wouldn't open their doors. Matt whispered that his whole arm was going numb, not just the injured hand, and I knew nerve death was starting after 25 minutes. I ran back to the house thinking I could find Lucas's van keys, but he followed me and grabbed a hammer from the garage, warning that he'd take my finger too if I touched anything of his. When I tried calling 911 again, Lucas grabbed my phone and smashed it with the hammer, then did the same to Matt's phone while saying there would be no cops or ambulance until he got his money. 30 minutes had passed and Matt was barely conscious with his lips turning blue. Then Lucas suddenly grabbed Matt's injured hand and pressed hard on the wound, making Matt scream as fresh blood poured out. That's when Lucas said something that made my blood run cold. Remember when you told me you couldn't pay because you needed that table saw for work? Remember what I said would happen? And Matt started sobbing harder, begging him to stop. Lucas looked at me. He thought I was joking when I said I'd take a finger for every month he owed. My stomach dropped. 40 minutes were gone and the finger in the bag was turning dark, while Matt begged me not to leave him alone with Lucas. I tried to drag Matt toward the street, but Lucas grabbed the bloody towel and squeezed Matt's mutilated hand, causing Matt to scream so loud I thought he'd pass out from the pain. Lucas said he'd squeeze every time we tried to leave. 45 minutes had passed and Matt was unconscious with shallow breathing. I tried to lift him, but Lucas kicked his injured hand and Matt woke up screaming in agony. Lucas told me to let him die or pay him, saying it was my choice. 50 minutes were gone and the finger was definitely dead tissue. Lucas saw me checking my watch and laughed, asking if I wanted to try another Uber. At 55 minutes, Lucas stood over us, spinning the car keys on his finger and watching Matt fade. He promised to move the van after the hour was up, but Matt had stopped responding to my voice with his pulse weak and rapid. Lucas knelt down and whispered that Matt should have paid rent, then looked at me and offered to make me a deal to save him. We had maybe 3 minutes left before the hour was up and the finger would be completely unsalvageable. Matt was dying from blood loss, and Lucas was still smiling. Lucas leaned closer and said he'd take my finger instead if I gave him $3,000 right now. Said he'd film it for proof I paid Matt's debt. My stomach twisted as I looked down at Matt, whose chest was barely moving, and his skin had turned this awful gray color like wet paper. I nodded slowly like I was thinking about it while my eyes searched the driveway for anything I could use. A rock, a stick, anything to fight back with. Lucas saw me looking around and laughed, waving the hammer in his right hand and telling me not to get any ideas because he was ready for whatever I tried. I told him okay, but he had to call 911 first so Matt wouldn't die, then he could have whatever he wanted from me. He shook his head and said payment always comes first in business. That's how the world works, and Matt's breathing got even more shallow and uneven. I grabbed Matt's good hand and squeezed as hard as I could, hoping the pain might bring him back to consciousness for just a second. His eyes opened halfway, and he made this weak, gasping sound before they closed again, but at least I knew he was still alive and fighting. Lucas took 3 steps toward me with the hammer raised up high, and I knew right then he was going to hurt me no matter what I said or did. I screamed louder than I've ever screamed in my life, screaming for help over and over until my throat burned, praying someone would finally come outside. Then I heard it. A siren somewhere in the distance getting louder every second, and Lucas's face went white as he spun around toward the sound. The wailing got closer and closer, and Lucas dropped the hammer on the concrete with a loud clang before running toward his van. I grabbed Matt under his arms and started dragging him toward the street while Lucas fumbled with his keys and cursed at the van. He jumped in and turned the key and the engine started, but when he tried to drive, the van lurched sideways on the flat tires. The metal rims scraped against the driveway, making this horrible grinding sound as he tried to move the van out of the way. I kept pulling Matt toward the curb and waving my free arm at the street as the siren got so loud I knew they were almost here. The ambulance turned the corner fast with lights flashing everywhere, and I waved both my bloody hands in the air, screaming that we needed help. 2 paramedics jumped out before the ambulance even stopped completely and ran toward us with their equipment while Lucas abandoned the van. He took off running toward the backyard and disappeared around the side of the house as the paramedics reached us. The first paramedic dropped to his knees next to Matt and started checking his neck for a pulse while pulling supplies from his bag. He yelled something to his partner about shock and blood loss while ripping open packages and pulling out tubes and needles. The second paramedic called for police backup on his radio, saying they had a trauma patient and a suspect who fled the scene. They worked so fast, starting an IV in Matt's arm and putting an oxygen mask over his face while checking his blood pressure. The first paramedic kept saying Matt's pulse was weak, but maybe 40 beats per minute. Way too low, but still hanging on. They lifted Matt onto a stretcher and I grabbed the bag with his finger, but the paramedic shook his head and said it was too late for that. I climbed into the back of the ambulance and held Matt's left hand while they worked on him during the ride. The paramedic looked at me while adjusting Matt's IV and said we did good keeping him alive this long, that most people would have died already. He said the finger was definitely gone forever, but Matt would make it if we got him to surgery fast enough for the blood loss. The ambulance flew through red lights with the siren blaring, and I watched them push medicines into Matt's IV that made his heart rate climb a little. The paramedic kept checking Matt's pupils with a flashlight and talking to the hospital on the radio about what they needed ready. I squeezed Matt's hand and told him to hang on, even though I don't think he could hear me over all the noise and machines. We pulled up to the emergency room and they rushed Matt straight through the doors while I followed behind, still covered in his blood. The doctors grabbed the stretcher and rushed Matt through another set of doors marked surgery, while a nurse stopped me from following and pointed me toward the waiting room. I stood there in the empty room with Matt's blood all over my shirt and hands, not knowing what to do with myself. The clock on the wall showed it was almost noon, and I realized I'd been awake since yesterday. A nurse walked over to me carrying green scrubs and introduced herself as Camilla Boyd. She led me to a bathroom and waited outside while I changed out of my bloody clothes and washed Matt's blood off my hands. The water in the sink turned pink, then red as I scrubbed under my nails trying to get it all off. Camilla was still there when I came out, and she walked me back to the waiting room where she sat down next to me. She asked if I needed anything, and I just shook my head because I couldn't think straight. The waiting room had these hard plastic chairs and a TV playing some cooking show with the sound turned down. Camilla stayed with me even though I could tell she had other things to do. She kept checking on me every few minutes and brought me water that I couldn't drink. 2 hours passed with no word about Matt, and I kept watching the surgery doors hoping someone would come tell me something. A man in a gray suit walked into the waiting room and showed me a police badge with the name Brett Carson on it. He sat down across from me and pulled out a recorder, asking if I could tell him what happened at the house. I started from the beginning with Matt's phone call and told him everything while Camilla moved closer and held my hand. Brett asked questions about Lucas and what he said and did, writing notes while the recorder captured every word. I told him about the hammer and the threats, and how Lucas wouldn't let us leave. I explained about the van blocking the driveway, and Lucas letting the air out of the tires. Brett nodded and kept writing, asking me to describe exactly what Lucas did to Matt's hand. I told him about Lucas pressing on the wound and making Matt scream, about the hour deadline for the finger. Camilla squeezed my hand tighter when I got to the part about Lucas offering to take my finger instead. Brett asked if I'd be willing to identify Lucas from photos, and I said yes immediately. He pulled out his phone and showed me pictures from the scene at the house. There was the hammer on the driveway covered in blood from where Lucas smashed our phones. Another photo showed the van with its flat tires still blocking the driveway at an angle. The blood on the concrete looked black in the police photos, and there was so much of it. Brett told me they found Lucas hiding in a shed 3 blocks away after a neighbor called about someone in their yard. He said Lucas tried to run, but they caught him and he was in custody now. I asked if Lucas said anything, and Brett shook his head, telling me Lucas asked for a lawyer right away. The waiting room doors opened and a woman ran in with tears streaming down her face. She looked around frantically until she saw me and rushed over asking where Matt was. I recognized her as Matt's sister Megan Whitfield from photos he'd shown me, though we'd never met in person. I explained that Matt was in surgery and had been there for over 2 hours already. Megan broke down crying harder and I stood up to hug her even though we were strangers. She kept saying thank you for saving him and asking what Lucas did to her brother. I told her the basic facts without all the horrible details because she was already falling apart. Brett introduced himself to Megan and said he'd need to talk to her later about Lucas and Matt's living situation. Another 2 hours went by with the 3 of us waiting while Brett asked more questions about what I knew. The surgery doors finally opened and a doctor in scrubs walked toward us looking tired. He told us Matt made it through surgery, but there was permanent damage to his hand. The finger couldn't be reattached after being separated for so long and the nerves were badly damaged. He said Matt would need months of physical therapy and might never get full use of his hand back. Megan started crying again and asked when she could see him. The doctor said Matt was in recovery and would be moved to a room in about an hour. He warned us that Matt would be groggy from the medicine and might not remember much at first. I sat back down feeling relief that Matt was alive mixed with anger about his hand being ruined forever. Camilla brought Megan tissues and water while we waited for them to move Matt to a regular room. When they finally let us in, Matt was lying in the hospital bed with machines beeping around him. His right hand was wrapped in thick white bandages and elevated on a pillow. Matt's eyes opened when he heard us come in, and he looked confused for a second. I walked over and took his left hand carefully while Megan stood on the other side of the bed. Matt squeezed my hand weakly and started whispering thank you over and over until I told him to rest. His voice was hoarse, and he kept trying to look at his bandaged hand. The nurse came in to check his vitals and adjust his pain medicine through the IV. Megan stayed with Matt while I went back to the waiting room where Brett was still working. He said he'd be back tomorrow with more questions and gave me his card in case I remembered anything else. I went home that night but couldn't sleep. Just kept seeing Lucas's smile and all that blood. The next morning I was back at the hospital when Brett showed up carrying an evidence bag. He pulled out a notebook and showed me pages covered in Lucas's handwriting. The notebook had detailed plans about hurting Matt, including drawings of tools and notes about fingers. Brett said this proved Lucas planned the attack for weeks, making it premeditated assault, not just a fight over rent. There were dates going back 2 months with Lucas writing about how Matt spent money on tools instead of rent. One page had a list of Matt's work schedule and when he'd be home alone. Brett took photos of me looking at the notebook for evidence while explaining what the charges would be. Later that day, a social worker came to Matt's room with paperwork about victim compensation funds. She explained that Matt couldn't work construction anymore with his hand damaged and would need help with medical bills. The surgery alone cost $20,000, and that didn't include the therapy he'd need for months. Matt tried to fill out the forms with his left hand, but kept getting frustrated and dropping the pen. The social worker said the state had funds for crime victims, but the process would take weeks to get approved. She helped Matt apply for disability benefits too, since he couldn't do physical work anymore. 3 days later, Brett called to tell me the prosecutor charged Lucas with attempted murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. The judge set bail at $500,000, which Lucas's family couldn't pay, so he stayed locked up. Brett said the trial would take months, but Lucas wasn't getting out anytime soon with those charges. I kept having nightmares about that day, waking up covered in sweat thinking I could still smell the blood. In my dreams, Lucas was always there with that smile, holding the hammer and laughing. Megan noticed I looked tired when I visited Matt and suggested I talk to someone about what happened. She gave me the name of a therapist who worked with trauma victims and said it helped her. I realized she was right because I couldn't stop thinking about those 57 minutes and what could have happened. I made an appointment for the next week, knowing I needed help to process everything that happened that day. 2 days later, the hospital moved Matt to a rehab place across town where they had special programs for people with hand injuries. The physical therapist Dakota Grimes came into his room that first morning and pulled the blanket right off him. She told him no more lying around feeling sorry for himself because they had work to do. Matt tried to argue, but she was already making him stand up and walk to the therapy room. She had him trying to pick up different sized blocks with his good hand while training his damaged one to assist. Matt kept dropping things and getting mad, but Dakota wouldn't let him quit. She made him practice for 2 hours straight until his whole arm was shaking from the effort. I showed up every morning to watch him work with Dakota, and it was hard seeing him struggle with stuff that used to be simple. He couldn't hold a pencil right or tie his shoes or even open a water bottle without help. One morning he got so frustrated trying to button his shirt that he threw it across the room and punched the wall with his good hand. Dakota just picked up the shirt and made him try again until he got it. She taught him tricks like using his teeth to hold things steady or pressing items against his body for leverage. After a week, Matt could dress himself, but it took him 20 minutes instead of 2. The prosecutor, Silas Mercer, came to the rehab center with a stack of papers and a laptop. He sat with us in the cafeteria and went through everything that would happen at trial. He showed us photos of the crime scene and the hammer Lucas used to smash our phones. He explained that Lucas was facing attempted murder charges, which could mean 20 years in prison if convicted. Silas said our testimony was the most important part because we were the only witnesses to what Lucas did. He warned us that Lucas's lawyer would try to make it seem like a normal roommate fight that got out of control. We spent 3 hours going over every detail while Silas took notes on his laptop. He asked Matt to describe exactly how the saw felt cutting through his finger, and Matt started shaking. Silas said the jury needed to hear these details to understand how bad it really was. 3 weeks after the attack, Matt finally got released from the rehab center, but he couldn't live alone. Megan and I worked out a schedule where one of us stayed with him every night. Matt's apartment had to be rearranged, so he could reach everything with one hand. We put special grips on his doorknobs and got him adaptive tools for the kitchen. He still needed help with things like opening jars or cutting food or doing laundry. Matt got angry a lot because simple tasks took forever and he kept dropping things. Megan bought him shirts with magnetic buttons, but he refused to wear them at first. I helped him practice typing with his left hand since he couldn't use his right properly anymore. The trial started 6 weeks after the attack and the courtroom was packed with people. Lucas's lawyer stood up and told the jury this was just 2 roommates fighting over money that went too far. He said Matt had threatened Lucas first, and Lucas was just defending himself. Then Silas got up and showed the jury Lucas's notebook with all the torture plans written weeks before. He played the neighbor's video showing Lucas blocking the driveway and deflating his tires. The jury could see Lucas standing there smiling while Matt bled on the ground. Silas showed them photos of the blood trail and the smashed phones and the hammer. He explained how Lucas had trapped us for 57 minutes while Matt almost died. On the second day of trial, they called me to testify, and I had to swear to tell the truth. I sat in that witness chair for 3 hours going through every single minute of that day. Silas asked me to describe Lucas's face when he was hurting Matt, and I said he was smiling the whole time. Lucas stared at me from the defense table with that same sick smile like he was enjoying this. His lawyer tried to say I was confused about what happened, but I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. I told them about Lucas squeezing Matt's wound and kicking his injured hand to wake him up. I explained how he threatened to take my finger too if I tried to help. The jury looked horrified when I described the blood and Matt going into shock. When Matt took the stand the next day, he held up his damaged hand for everyone to see. He showed them where his index finger used to be and how the other fingers didn't work right. He described the sound of the saw going through bone and how Lucas had laughed while doing it. Several people in the jury started crying when Matt talked about thinking he was going to die. He explained how he begged Lucas to let us go to the hospital, but Lucas just kept demanding money. Matt's voice broke when he described Lucas pressing on his wound to cause more pain. The defense lawyer asked Matt if he'd threatened Lucas, but Matt said he'd never hurt anyone. The neighbor who filmed everything testified on day 4, and his video was played for the jury. You could clearly see Lucas standing in the street waving away the Uber driver. The video showed him letting air out of his tires while Matt bled on the driveway. He testified that Lucas had screamed lies about Matt being a thief to keep people from helping. The neighbor said he was scared to come outside because Lucas seemed crazy and violent. His footage proved that Lucas had deliberately prevented us from leaving for almost an hour. When Lucas took the stand on day 5, he tried to act calm and reasonable. He claimed Matt had attacked him first with a wrench and he was just defending himself. But Silas pulled out Lucas's notebook and read his plans to hurt Matt out loud. He showed the jury that Lucas had written about taking fingers for unpaid rent weeks earlier. Lucas tried to say it was just angry thoughts, but Silas proved he'd bought the saw specifically for this. The timeline destroyed Lucas's story because the neighbor's video started before any supposed attack. Lucas got angry on the stand and started yelling that Matt deserved it for not paying. His lawyer tried to object, but Lucas kept talking about how Matt had disrespected him. The jury deliberated for 2 whole days while we waited in the hallway outside. Matt couldn't sit still and kept pacing back and forth holding his damaged hand. Megan brought us sandwiches, but nobody could eat because we were too nervous. Brett stopped by to check on us and said the long deliberation was actually a good sign. Finally, the bailiff came out and said the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom and I held Matt's good hand while we waited. The judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict, and he stood up with the paper shaking. Guilty of attempted murder in the 1st degree. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of aggravated assault. Matt started crying and collapsed into his chair while Megan hugged both of us. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks, knowing Lucas couldn't hurt anyone else. 2 weeks later, we were back in the same courtroom for sentencing, and I sat between Matt and Megan while we waited for the judge to decide Lucas's fate. Lucas stood in his orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him, and his lawyer asked for mercy because of his clean record before this. The judge looked through her papers for a long time, then started talking about how Lucas had planned everything out and tortured Matt for an hour while he bled. She called it sadistic torture and said Lucas was a danger to society, who couldn't be trusted around other people. The prosecutor had asked for 20 years, but the judge gave him 18 with no chance of early release, and Lucas's face went white when she said it. Matt grabbed my hand and squeezed hard while tears ran down his face because 18 years meant Lucas couldn't hurt anyone for a really long time. The bailiffs led Lucas away, and he looked back at Matt one last time with pure hate in his eyes before they took him through the door. We walked out of the courthouse, and Matt stopped on the steps to take a deep breath of fresh air like he could finally breathe again. Dakota called Matt the next morning to schedule his first appointment at the rehab center, where she worked as a physical therapist. I drove him there because he still couldn't drive with his damaged hand, and we found Dakota waiting in a bright therapy room full of different tools and equipment. She examined Matt's hand carefully and tested what movement he still had in his remaining fingers, which wasn't much. Dakota showed him special grips he could attach to things like forks and toothbrushes that would help him hold them without needing his index finger. Matt struggled at first and threw the fork across the room when he couldn't get it to work right, but Dakota just picked it up and helped him try again. She taught him how to use his middle finger as his new pointer and how to adjust his grip to compensate for the missing digit. Matt practiced opening jars and bottles with a special tool that gave him more leverage since his grip strength was so weak now. Dakota had him squeeze therapy putty for 20 minutes to build up the muscles that still worked in his hand. By the end of the session, Matt was sweating and frustrated, but he'd managed to write his name with his left hand for the first time. I started seeing Aliyah the next week after Megan gave me her number because I wasn't sleeping and kept having nightmares about blood. Aliyah's office was small and quiet with soft chairs, and she let me talk for the whole first session about what happened that day. She helped me understand that my brain was still stuck in survival mode, even though the danger was over, and that's why I kept reliving it. Aliyah taught me breathing exercises to do when I felt panic rising, and showed me how to ground myself by naming 5 things I could see and hear. She told me my quick thinking had saved Matt's life, even though I couldn't save his finger, and that I did everything possible under impossible circumstances. We talked about survivor's guilt, and and how I felt bad that I wasn't hurt when Matt lost so much that day. Alaya helped me see that supporting Matt through his recovery was important too, and that I didn't have to be physically injured to have trauma from what Lucas did. Matt got a letter saying he was approved for disability benefits, which would help pay his bills while he couldn't work construction anymore. The vocational rehab counselor met with us to talk about what kind of job Matt could do with his injury and suggested office work since he could still type. Matt hated the idea at first because he'd always worked with his hands, but the counselor showed him data entry jobs that paid decent money. He signed up for computer classes at the community college and started learning Excel and other programs he'd need for office work. Matt practiced typing with his 9 fingers and got faster each week, even though it felt weird not having his index finger for the home keys. 6 weeks after the attack, Matt called to ask if I wanted to get dinner to celebrate his progress in therapy. We went to his favorite burger place and he showed me how he could hold a burger now with his adapted grip that Dakota taught him. He made a dark joke about Lucas getting prison food for 18 years while we ate real burgers, and we both laughed even though it wasn't really funny. Matt told me he'd been approved for a new apartment closer to his therapy appointments, and away from the house where everything happened. Megan came over the next weekend with boxes, and we helped Matt pack up his stuff from the old place. We painted his new apartment together with Matt doing the edges with his left hand, while Megan and I did the walls. The new place felt fresh and safe without any memories of Lucas, or that awful day attached to it. At physical therapy, Matt met another patient who'd lost 3 fingers in a factory accident 2 years earlier. They started talking, and the guy showed Matt tricks he'd learned for doing everyday tasks with missing fingers. The two of them became friends and met for coffee sometimes to support each other through the hard days. I went back to work but had a panic attack the first time I heard sirens outside the office building. My hands started shaking and I couldn't breathe, and my coworker had to help me sit down until it passed. I called Alaya, and she taught me a grounding technique where I pressed my feet hard into the floor and focused on that sensation. She had me practice it every day, so it would be automatic when I needed it during a panic attack. The panic attacks kept happening but got less intense as I practiced the techniques Alaya taught me. Matt finished his vocational training after 2 months and started applying for data entry jobs with help from the counselor. He got 3 interviews and wore a suit for the first time in his life, which made him laugh at how different he looked. The third company hired him to do data entry for their shipping department, and he started the next Monday. The job wasn't his dream, but it paid enough to cover his rent and bills, and he felt good about working again. 3 months after the attack, we got invited to speak at a victim impact panel for other people who'd survived violent crimes. Matt stood up in front of 30 people and told them about losing his finger and learning to live with his injury. He said surviving was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it was possible even when you thought you couldn't make it through another day. The civil lawsuit papers came in the mail 4 months after the attack, and the lawyer said we had a strong case for Matt's medical bills and lost wages since Lucas had been convicted. The judgment came back in Matt's favor for $200,000, but Lucas's family only had their house to sell, and Matt got about $60,000 after the lawyers took their cut. Matt started going to a support group at the hospital where he met a woman whose brother had been stabbed during a robbery, and she understood what it was like to watch someone you care about go through trauma. They started getting coffee after meetings, and she never asked him to explain why his hand shook sometimes, or why loud noises made him jump. I was still waking up at 3 in the morning covered in sweat and seeing Lucas's face every time I closed my eyes, but Alaya kept telling me it would get better with time. One night I slept all the way through without nightmares, and woke up confused because the sun was actually up, and I felt rested for the first time in months. Alaya said this was huge progress and wrote it down in my file with a big smile on her face. Matt sent me a video on my phone of him playing his old guitar using this weird new finger position Dakota had helped him figure out, where he used his thumb and middle finger differently. He was playing this complicated song I recognized from before the attack, and it sounded just as good as when he had all his fingers. The woman from support group was in the background of the video cheering him on, and I could see how happy he looked. 6 months after sentencing, we got called back to court because Lucas was trying to appeal his conviction, saying his lawyer hadn't defended him properly. Matt and I sat in the courtroom while Lucas's new lawyer argued that the first one should have pushed harder on the self-defense claim, but the judge cut him off after 20 minutes. The judge said the evidence was clear with the video and the notebook and our testimony, and Lucas's own admission on the stand that he'd planned it. The appeal got denied in less than an hour, and Lucas got taken back to prison while his mom cried in the gallery. Matt's boss at the data entry job called him into the office 8 months after he started, and Matt thought he was getting fired, but instead they offered him a team leader position with better pay. He found a nicer apartment in a better part of town with security cameras and a doorman, and asked me to help him move his stuff. We packed up his things, and I noticed he'd thrown away anything that reminded him of the old house, including some furniture he'd had since college. The new place had big windows and felt safe, and Matt said he could finally breathe again without worrying about who might show up at his door. Almost a year to the day after the attack, Matt texted me asking if I wanted to get coffee at our old spot downtown. We sat at the same table we used to sit at in college and talked about his job and my therapy, and his girlfriend and normal stuff that had nothing to do with Lucas or that day. He ordered his coffee with his left hand without even thinking about it, and held the cup steady with his damaged right hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then he rolled up his sleeve and showed me the tattoo he'd gotten on his right forearm, right above where the scars from the surgery were still visible. It said, "Survivor," in simple black letters with the date of the attack underneath, and he said he wanted to remember that he'd made it through the worst day of his life. He told me the tattoo artist had asked about the scars, and he'd told the whole story without crying for the first time. We finished our coffee and hugged goodbye, and I watched him walk away with his girlfriend who'd been waiting outside, and they looked like any other couple heading home on a Sunday afternoon. Thanks for hanging in there with me through all the questioning and wondering. Really enjoyed exploring these moments right alongside you all. Subscribe for more content like this.